Let me start with presenting our work joined with Philipp Jaschke from the IAB and Marco Tabellini from the Harvard Business School, entitled Scared Straight: Threat and Assimilation of Refugees in Germany. As you all know, we've experienced a dramatic increase in the number of forcibly displaced people in the world. This is not just happening in Europe, but worldwide, and the UNHCR is estimating the number of forcibly displaced to 70 million. Since 2015, Europe, and particularly Germany, has experienced a sharp increase in the number of monthly asylum applications. As you can see here, this has been starting to increase already in the 2013 year, and then having a sharp increase in 2015 and a sharp decline after 2016, when the European Union entered the EU-Turkey deal. So, alongside this rise in the number of asylum applicants, we've also experienced a rise in the support for right-wing and anti-immigration parties. And these narratives are fueled by the idea that refugees aren't willing or able to assimilate culturally and economically. And when we talk about the determinants of successful assimilation, we oftentimes talk about the characteristics of refugees themselves. So their effort, their abilities, their language skills, their cultural or religious background, their education, and so on and so forth. So in this paper, we try to swap this perspective a bit, and we focus on natives' attitudes, and particularly natives' hostility in the threat environment, in determining the assimilation path of refugees. So we relate our paper to a vast literature, both on the economics of cultural transmission. I've done some work with Hillel Rapoport and Arthur Silve on how migration leads to cultural or conversions or divergence across countries. Obviously, we relate to the literature on refugee migration. Herbert has done some work on this. We're also relating to Cevada Exoy and Pano Putvara's work on initial conditions and refugee integration. And then more broadly to the literature on immigrant assimilation. Marco has done some work with Vicky Fuka together. But what about the impact of threat on the assimilation of minority groups? Well, we find ambiguous results in this setting. So there are a few papers that address the question of threat on the assimilation of minority groups in a historical setting. Papers in economics and political science are, for instance, exploiting things like the attack on Pearl Harbor, on name-giving patterns of Japanese immigrants in the United States, and find that in response to this sort of hostility against the Japanese after this attack, immigrants give their children more American-sounding names to sort of signal an allegiance to the national culture. But on the other hand, we also see settings where refugees or immigrants backlash against a threat environment. For instance, Vicky Fuka shows in a paper also for the US that Germans give less American-sounding names, intermarriage rates are lower, and naturalization rates are lower in the context of World War II. So there are some ambiguous results in the historical settings, but also in the modern settings, when we look at the effect of threat on the economic and multidimensional integration of immigrants and refugees, we find ambiguous results, but mostly if we look at the economic side of it, we see that there's some negative effect of threat and hostility on the economic integration of refugees. So what we do in this paper here is we ask, how does threat impact the assimilation path of refugees in the German setting? What we're doing is we exploit basically the quasi-random assignment of refugees to different regions that have different characteristics, and we focus on the characteristics of threat on the assimilation of refugees. We build a threat index composed of the right-wing vote share and hate crimes against refugees. We apply an intent to treat approach. So we basically look at the region, the characteristics of the region of assignment in constructing our outcome and treatment variable. We exploit a rich data set with individual level regressions and multidimensional fixed effects. And we spend a great share of the paper ruling out that our results are driven by ex-ante selection of refugees or ex-post sorting. And what we're trying to do is we try to disentangle cultural and economic assimilation and uncover some of the mediating factors. And what we do, and which I will show you in a minute, that we can try to rationalize our findings into assimilation effort as a one-sided input into successful assimilation as an equilibrium outcome. So just to give you a preview of our findings, we see that refugees culturally assimilate and economically assimilate over time and do so substantially. So refugees close the cultural gap with locals by 5% every year, and they increase their employment probability by 50% every year. Now, if we turn to the effect of threat, we see that threat increases cultural assimilation, but decreases economic assimilation. So to just have an idea about this, moving a refugee from the 25th percentile of the threat distribution to the 75th percentile increases cultural assimilation by 50%. And despite the fact that there's higher cultural assimilation in threat regions, employment growth is slower in these hostile areas. So I'll just briefly talk about the data that we're using, the empirical strategy, ruling out some concerns about our identifying assumptions, present some baseline results, look at the threat environment, and provide you with some additional insight that sort of paint a broader picture of what we're trying to do here. So most of you will be familiar with the data that we're using. So we have survey data both on the side of refugees and on the side of locals. We use the IAB BAMF sub-survey of refugees. We have a representative sample of asylum seekers in Germany that arrived between 2013 and 2016 and were interviewed between 2016 and 18. We have a whole area of question, including attitudes, preferences, and labor market outcomes. And what is nice about this setting is that we can sort of transpose all of the questions that we have for refugees to a representative survey of 34,000 private households in Germany, thereby exploiting the granularity of the cultural differences across regions and really exploiting regional variation in this context. And then we have some control variables using the unemployment rate, population size, and refugee shares. We have data on hate crimes against refugees that are geolocated, vote shares for right-wing parties. We have from the statistics office, the network size at the local level and the economic integration of immigrants from the same origin region. So how do we measure assimilation? So we measure cultural assimilation as the convergence in stated preferences to locals in the same NUTS2 region. So this can be actual beliefs, but it can also just be the signaling of cultural similarity, and we'll talk about that in more detail later on. We construct a Euclidean Index of cultural similarity. This is based on work that I've done with Hillel and Arthur on this, and we use the universe of questions that are overlapping between refugees and locals. And what we do is we fix locals' preferences at baseline so that we don't endogenize the response in locals' preferences response to the refugee influx. So for instance, here you can see sort of the average cultural similarity between refugees and locals once we include state fixed effects in all of the controls. So this is basically the residual variation that we're going to be exploiting in this paper. And then if you also just look at the change over time, you can see this is non-conditional, basically divide arrival cohorts of refugees over time. And then looking at the cultural similarity, you see an increase in cultural similarity across these cohorts. Now, how do we think about economic assimilation? That's a more straightforward way of measuring this. It's basically just the access to the labor market. Having a job at the time of the interview and the log wage at the time of the interview. How do we measure threat? So basically our treatment variable, we create an index, the first principal component that Marco uses in a paper with Nancy Qiang at the NUTS 2 level, so the subnational level. We include vote share for right-wing parties, as well as hate crimes against refugees in 2014 and 15. We're currently working on an expansion of these measures. So we're using alternative measures of cultural assimilation that go beyond the convergence of stated preferences. It's a feeling of belonging to Germany, the intention to apply for citizenship, wearing a headscarf, etc. Economic assimilation, we're trying to link the survey data to admin data on employment, trying to circumvent some of the reporting biases that we know. We're also currently extending the threat environment index. We're adding historical data on pogroms, vote for historical right-wing parties, additional survey data that shed some light on ethnocentristic views of the population. So what we're trying to do in our regression is basically look at economic or cultural assimilation as the cultural similarity or labor market status of the refugee I in location L at survey year T. And we're looking at the baseline. So what is the effect of any additional month spent in Germany on these outcomes? And then we want to look at the interaction term between the month spent in Germany and the threat environment. So what's the difference in your assimilation path if you're assigned to a location of high threat? We include a vector of individual and regional level controls. The typical ones: age, gender, education at entry, work experience at entry, country of origin, and marital status, all at entry, again, to avoid issues of endogeneity of these variables. And then what we also do is we use regional characteristics at baseline and interact them with year variables in order to account for changes, linear changes in these factors across survey waves. We also have multidimensional fixed effects. So we have district fixed effects, survey year fixed effects, and questionnaire composition fixed effects. So there are a few threats to identification when we want to causally interpret this coefficient beta 1, and for that matter, the previous ones. So what we've tried to identify is the effect of the duration of stay on assimilation and the duration of stay interacted with threat on assimilation. And there are two major sources of issues that could avoid us being able to interpret this causally. One of them is ex ante selection. So local authorities could have changed allocation regimes over time. So that means that it's not the duration of stay that impacts assimilation, but that authorities sort of became worse at culturally or economically matching refugees to regions over time. And then there's also the issue of ex post sorting. So it could be that over time, refugees selectively out-migrate out of threat regions or regions that are culturally more dissimilar or are less favorable economically. So we start tackling these issues with a number of tests. So first we look at the selection on the side of authorities, and what we try to do here is we check the whether the probability of assignment to a certain region has changed over time. So since we don't know what the cultural preferences of refugees were before they entered Germany, we basically look at predetermined pre-entry characteristics of refugees. And we look at whether the probability of assignment to certain regions has changed over time. Yeah. So we look at this for rural, urban, high and low unemployment, but also we look at this threat specific. So did the assignment to threat regions change over time? And what we basically do is we take these pre-entry variables, interact them with the year of arrival, and see whether the likelihood of assignment has changed over time. And as you can see, there's no systematic changes of assignment regimes over time. And most importantly, we basically use our threat index to check for that. And there doesn't seem to be a selective allocation process taking place. What we also do is we take the arrival cohorts that basically just arrived very recently, so in the past 9 months, and we take their cultural similarity, supposing that they haven't been exposed as much to local culture yet, and we check whether they have been differentially assigned to regions, and we also don't find any evidence on that. We also introduce year of arrival fixed effects, basically just exploiting variation in the 12 months between arrival in Germany and departure to make sure our results are not driven by overall compositional changes in refugees. Now, sorting on the side of refugees, we have one quick fix, which is what I've mentioned before, is that we use an intent to treat approach. So we use the characteristics of the region of assignment and not the region of residence in determining all of these dimensions. What we also do is we exploit a policy that was introduced in 2016 that prohibited the free movement of refugees across regions. And we see that our results hold even for the subset of refugees that weren't allowed to move. And then since we have the region of assignment and the region of residence, we can explicitly test out selection based on cultural similarity or economic success by comparing movers to non-movers. Basically what we do is we run our baseline regression for the cultural similarity index, but also the subcomponents of the cultural similarity index and our employment outcome. This is basically our estimation of the dummy for whether you've been a mover or not mover. And interestingly, which is also maybe an important corollary finding of this paper, is that we don't find sort of differential effects on economic or cultural assimilation based on the moving status of refugees. What we also do is we test whether there has been threat-specific out-selection. So even if movers and stayers on average are not different, has there been differential out-selection out of threat regions? And we don't find evidence for the fact that refugees are more likely to move out of threat regions. So overall, we don't think that ex post cultural or economic selection is driving our results. We do a number of additional robustness checks, accounting for economic factors that may correlate with threat. We have alternative statistical measures for cultural similarity. We also make sure that our results are not driven by differential survey attrition in threat environments and not differential survey attrition based on cultural similarity. So let me get to the baseline results. So this is our main table looking at cultural assimilation of refugees over time, and column 7 is our preferred specification, again with all of the fixed effects and individual and district level controls. And we see a strong positive effect of every additional month spent in Germany on the cultural similarity between refugees and locals living in the same NUTS2 region. We do the same for the employment status of the refugee and the wage at the time of the interview. Again, column 7, including all of the fixed effects and controls. And again, here we see an increase in the economic assimilation, both at the extensive and intensive margin for refugees. So how do we quantify this? We basically compare the average cultural similarity between refugees and locals and the cultural similarity within locals. And we look at how much time has to pass by to close this gap. And we see that every year refugees close this cultural gap by 5%. And every year, the employment probability of refugees increases by 50% respective to the sample mean. But now, those are the baseline results, and they can be interpreted quite optimistically, but how does threat impact these assimilation patterns? So basically, for the polynomial specification, so including the square terms and all of the interactions of the square terms, we find a significantly positive effect of threat on cultural assimilation of refugees. However, when we look at the effect of threat on labor market integration, we see a weak but negative link of threat on economic assimilation of refugees. So how can that be? So on the one hand, we see that a threat environment sort of increases cultural assimilation but decreases economic assimilation. This is basically the interpretation of this, which I've mentioned before. So if you move a refugee from a 25th to the 75th percentile, they increase their effort by their cultural assimilation by 50%. And despite this higher cultural assimilation, they are slower to integrate in threat areas. So it's a bit difficult to make sense of these results, but we've come up with a little bit of a framework to try to rationalize this. So we try to think of assimilation as a two-sided process, that depends both on refugees' input into assimilation and locals' willingness to cooperate. And we think of refugees as people who can invest in costly assimilation effort with a convex cost function, and they can accumulate this asset over time. And in each period, with a certain probability that depends on their cumulative assimilation effort, they can successfully assimilate and earn a higher wage. And what refugees do is they trade off the cost of investing in this costly assimilation effort and the relative returns to successful assimilation. So you can think of this as I'm investing time in learning the language. What do I get from learning the language? Well, access to social and economic opportunities. But the probability of refugees to be actually able to employ this asset, it depends on the willingness to cooperate by locals. And locals sort of set a level of assimilation that they require from refugees in order to be willing to interact with them. And we think of it as threat regions sort of having a higher threshold level for cultural assimilation in order to allow refugees to access these social and economic opportunities. So refugees are confronted with a surrounding that demands a higher level of assimilation and then adjust their effort according to that. So what can happen is basically, in the absence of threat, which is basically the blue line, refugees are confronted with a threshold level of cultural assimilation at C bar and would be able to enter the labor market at T star. Now, when they're faced with a higher level of required assimilation, they would only be able to enter the labor market at a later stage at T prime star. And confronted with this, they will adjust their assimilation effort. So on the one hand, in threat regions, you may observe that refugees increase assimilation effort, but still are only able to enter the labor market at a later stage, as if they were assigned to a low threat region. So maybe in this context, we can think about the fact that threat environments increase assimilation effort, but decrease assimilation success. And you can expand this framework by integrating refugee and immigrant networks into this. But in principle, we think of this as assimilation pressure exerted by the local population. So you're sort of surrounded in a threatening environment, and maybe out of fear and pressure, you want to signal that you belong for fear of being discriminated against, for fear of being attacked, and so on. But in the end, this increase in signaling cultural similarity does not translate into more successful assimilation. So at the same time, refugees are somewhat scared and need to signal and deviate from their initial preferences, but this effort is not being rewarded proportionately. So can we really interpret this measure of cultural assimilation as effort? Well, what we do to look at that is to say, okay, first we have to really think, can we really think of cultural similarity and stated preference as a signaling tool rather than an equilibrium outcome for which you need the interaction and cooperation of locals? And what we find is that once refugees enter the labor market in threat regions, their cultural similarity decreases. So the increase sort of has a sharp drop once refugees enter the labor market. You would think if they enter the labor market, they would be more integrated in the society. Cultural similarity may actually accelerate, but this discontinuity shows us that there might be something about the signaling value of cultural similarity that is driving this result. And again, if we, for instance, look at refugees that live in shelters, where you would think, again, interaction with locals would be a bit harder, you might be more sort of inward oriented. If cultural similarity would be really an equilibrium outcome, you might expect that in refugees assigned to refugee shelters might have a lower ability to absorb the culture around them. But we see that refugees that live in shelters in threat regions show a higher level of cultural assimilation. Yeah, so they are easily identifiable. They are surrounded by people who vote for right-wing parties, who commit hate crimes, including asylum seeker homes, and then are basically signaling cultural similarity more. And what we also show is if we lag cultural similarity for a subset of refugees for which we have panel data, we see that given a certain level of cultural similarity, refugees are less likely to be employed in threat regions. Yeah. So in threat regions, it really seems to be the case that locals are demanding a higher level of cultural assimilation in order to allow refugees in their midst on the labor market. We also use different concepts of threat. For instance, we look at the cultural homogeneity and distinctiveness of locals. So we move away from vote for the right wing or hate crimes and just look at the fact if you have a very culturally homogeneous group, then refugees are also converging faster culturally to these people. And then what we also see is that networks can have a mediating impact on this. So refugee and immigrant networks basically decrease the assimilation pressure and therefore have a negative impact on cultural assimilation and an ambiguous effect on labor market integration. So overall, we find evidence consistent with the threat hypothesis, which is a rather novel, at least in economics, an understudied dimension of assimilation. And we try to sort of rationalize our results into this idea of assimilation being a two-sided process. So moving away the focus from the characteristics and determinants on the refugee sides and going into the attitudes and ideas of locals and their effect on successful assimilation. And beyond that, it's a broader policy question, because oftentimes cultural assimilation is interpreted as some measure of successful assimilation. So people look at convergence in preferences over time across generation, and they say, look, there's this convergence in preferences, and this means that that these immigrants or refugees are successfully assimilating. But if we now see that this sort of signaling of cultural similarity can indeed be a result of pressure or threat or even fear of violence, then we have to ask ourselves whether these kinds of measures are really the right tool to measure successful integration. Yeah, so there's still a lot more work to do. We're currently working on a second draft of the paper. And this is why I'm very much looking forward to your comments and suggestions.